Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker with three massive stories for you tonight. We'll begin the show with an interview with Sina, Toossi, an Iran analyst on the latest in the US and Israel's illegal war on Iran. After that, I'll be joined by David Waring, expert on the Middle East, to discuss the war's economic consequences and how this is all affecting the Gulf states. And we close the show with an interview with Nate Soares. He's one of the authors of If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies. That's the argument. An AI doomer, very, very smart, very intelligent. I'm scarily convinced. We'll be putting out a longer interview with him in the coming days, but for this show, I spoke to him about the Pentagon declaring Anthropic a supply chain risk. Before we begin, I wanted to start the show with a thank you. And we've had 100 new paying supporters sign up this week. Often when there's a big news event in the news, and people turn to Novara Media, that's when people realize, how much you value what the team does. So we really do appreciate that. Of course, it is because in these big moments, people sign up to support us that we can, properly cover everything that is going on. It takes a big crew to make this show if you're looking throughout the whole organization. So please do consider joining. If you're one of those new 100 people, thank you so much. Welcome. If you've been a subscriber for yonks, thank you so much. Thank you for being on this journey with us. If you are an enjoyer of this show, but you haven't yet made the plunge to become a financial supporter, please do consider signing up at NovaraMedia.com/support. Whatever you can afford is really, really welcome. We're really, really grateful for it. Donald Trump's war aims in Iran are continuously shifting. At times, it sounds like he wants regime change. Then sometimes he wants a Venezuela option where he just gets to pick someone from the regime and say, oh, we can sign some kind of deal. It's all a mess. It changes from day to day, hour to hour, which would be entertaining if there weren't so many lives at stake. This afternoon, we got another version of what the president wants from this illegal war. So this is a post to Truth Social. He says, there will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender, in caps. After that, and the selection of a great and acceptable leader, we and many of our wonderful and very brave allies and partners will work tirelessly to bring Iran back from the brink of destruction, making it economically bigger, better, and stronger than ever before. Iran will have a great future. Make Iran great again. MIGA. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. So unconditional surrender and basically I will choose your next leader, is what he's saying. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, also says actually that he doesn't think a deal is on the cards.
We are not asking for a ceasefire. And we don't see any reason why we should negotiate with the US. When we negotiated with them twice, and every time they attacked us at the middle of negotiations. So there is no request for a ceasefire by us, and there is no request for the negotiation with the US from us. We have never sent any messages to them.
So what will happen if no negotiations do take place? Well, for Israel, at least, state collapse appears to be the preference. In a chilling quote to the Financial Times, a leading Israeli expert on Iran summarized the Israeli government's war aims as follows. If we can have a coup, great. If we can have people on the streets, great. If we can have a civil war, great. Israel couldn't care less about the future or the stability of Iran. Now that's an analyst talking about what Israel's view is, but sort of very senior Israeli analyst. I should just confirm, in case you sort of start shouting at Danny Citrinovich. I don't think he's saying that's his position. That's what he understands to be the Israeli government's position. A CNN reporter who has entered Iran, though, despite all these demands for state collapse, has found the scene surprisingly calm.
Taking a quick break for a coffee along the way. We've been driving for several hours. There's a couple of things that we've noticed. Number one is that, first of all the shops are open. All the shops are really well stocked, even with fresh things, like, for instance, fruits and vegetables. Coffee, obviously, also available as well. And then also the gas stations. There's no long lines as gas stations. Fuel seems readily available, and you just don't see any sort of degree of panic anywhere.
So he's not in Tehran yet, but sort of he was surprised by how functioning, it seemed, as it stands. And well, to discuss the latest in the war on Iran, I spoke earlier to Sina Toossi. He's a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. And I began by asking for his response, his analysis of Donald Trump demanding Iran's unconditional surrender.
Yeah, this is typical. I mean, it's arguably diluted when faced with the realities of the battlefield and what's happening on the ground right now. Like Iran shows no signs of being anywhere close to an unconditional scenario situation. They're continuing to hit back in the region, ballistic missiles, drones. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed. They've been hitting Israel with more advanced munitions. It seems like a lot of these very expensive interceptors that the US and Israel already had very limited supply. They already drained upwards of a third of them last summer in the June war, that those are being spent, if not largely spent. And yesterday, for the first time, there was reports out of Israel that the sirens weren't going off at the right time. The bombs were hitting, the missiles were hitting without any kind of alarms. And, Iran is using these more advanced munitions that are seemingly, I don't know if they're cluster, but they're kind of detaching, and there's like multiple warheads that are heading that makes it even more difficult to intercept. At the same time, within the country, there's no signs of, regime cohesion falling apart. So it's like totally diluted, I would argue, what Trump is saying. And he said similar stuff throughout the course of the 12-day war, talking about unconditional surrender. And at the end, he was screaming at Netanyahu to accept the surrender.
Let's park, I suppose, the integrity of the regime and whether it's holding together for a moment and focus on this sort of question of military balance. Because on Wednesday's show, we were discussing a press conference that Pete Hegseth gave with the chair of the Joint Chief of Staff, Dan Kane, where they were saying that Iran, it started strong with all of these missiles and drones, but actually they're down 86%. So they're saying from the weekend to Wednesday, the number of rockets or missiles being fired from Iran had gone dramatically down. And that suggests that they're running out. And so time will favor the Americans and the Israelis is essentially what he was saying. I mean, what's your interpretation of that?
So right now, one of the main battles and equations of this war is this equation of the number of missiles Iran is firing and the number of interceptors that the US and Israel and their Gulf allies have. And how much Iran could hit these targets. Now, from the get-go, as you said, Iran was firing larger salvos of missiles. And we already know multiple, US radar systems have been hit, multiple THAAD missile interception systems, which is the most advanced, sophisticated US ballistic missile interception system. And Jordan has been hit, according to CNN, and the UAE has been hit. So, yes, the US and Israel are going after the launchers of these ballistic missiles. Now, these launchers are spread out across this big country that is Iran, massive country that is Iran. They're claiming 56% of launchers or however amount have been destroyed, and they're hunting them down. And these ballistic missiles do give off a signature on radar and other sensors when they're launched. They all portable launchers for the most part, although the other day there was this video, I don't know how accurate it was, but there was a video seemingly showing a missile being launched from an underground silo in Iran. That could be a big development if accurate. Regardless, Iran has, the US claim is that the reason the number of missiles launched has gone down is because they're destroying the interceptors. The Iranians are saying, and this has been in their military strategy and public documents, very much telegraphed from Iranians, that they are preparing for a long war of attrition. And it was always the plan to initially go high on the number of missile launches and then go lower, but then keep them steady. And I think so. What's the key thing to decipher here and to analyze here is not necessarily, these claims from US and Israeli officials, but how long is Ben Gurion Airport going to be closed? How long are Israelis, 10 million Israelis going to be in shelters 24/7 with all the economic costs that entails? Because regardless of the reality of how many launchers are being hit, that these missiles are still coming, these missiles are still hitting, the sirens are still going off. There's a big censorship regime, so it's very hard to say what is being hit, what is not, but clearly they're being hits, and there was hits last night. And the same situation is applying in the Persian Gulf region. And over there, over these shorter ranges, Iran's drones, which are very sophisticated, which it's been exporting to Russia and other countries, the Shahed drone, those, it is in a much more stronger position to actually fire in perpetuity because A, they're much cheaper. B, they can be launched from pretty much like a back of a pickup truck. They don't leave any signatures, and they can hit targets accurately with speed and with a heavy payload. They can hit tankers, they can hit critical infrastructure, US bases in the region. As we've been seeing, they've been hitting in Bahrain, Kuwait, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. So Iran still has a lot of capability to hit back and continue hitting back in this war of attrition. So that's to my point that Trump's talk of unconditional surrender, much like he made that comment during the June war and later saw the ceasefire, right now it doesn't seem in line with the realities of this war.
Do you think in a way he was responding to what the Iranian foreign minister Araghchi had said? Because the day before Trump, made this tweet, Araghchi had said to, I think it was NBC, one of the American networks, we don't want a deal. We're not interested in a ceasefire deal anyway. So is this almost just Trump saying, well, we didn't want the deal first? Is it something almost a bit more childish than him actually sort of having a preference, and it's more him trying to save face?
It very well could be. I mean, with Trump, that often proves to be the case. I mean, the rhetoric consistently from Iranian officials is that they're not seeking a ceasefire at this stage. They're not seeking negotiations at this stage. Now, there's been reporting both suggesting that U.S. officials were, like, for example, as early as last Sunday, a day into this war, Israeli Ynet News, I remember, reported that through Italy, the U.S. was seeking a ceasefire. There's been other reporting suggesting that certain elements of Iran have been seeking a ceasefire. But at the leadership level, from the senior officials in Iran, Ali Larijani, the Leadership Council, security, consistently the message is that they're not going for a ceasefire in that stage. And that is actually in line with the broader strategy that Iran has had for this war that they've prepared for decades. And this is also, U.S. assessments of Iranian military strategy have also held this, that Iran, especially now, it can't really afford to come out of this war without a ceasefire that is favorable to it insofar as preventing this scenario from repeating every 6 months or every year. So they need something that can give them kind of security guarantees, that can give them economic relief. Short of that, I think with this new leadership in Iran, I think one thing to watch out for is the nuclear weapons option, which Khamenei, the assassinated leader last week, had a fatwa against. They never weaponized, even though they could under his leadership. They always kept the option open, but they never did. And what we know about Iran's remaining nuclear capability, the nearly 500 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, most likely they still have many of these advanced centrifuges. I would assess that they still have the ability to covertly, in a small covert facility, to dash for the bomb. So that's another thing to watch out for. But I think this war, until Iran can get more favorable diplomatic settlement that's going to prevent this from happening again, they're most likely incentivized to continue raising the costs for the U.S.
So something, I mean, obviously there's many things that are worrying about this war, but something that worries me in terms of what the end game might be is what you've just said there, and all the analysis I've read sort of says the same thing, which is that if the Iranian regime remains intact, then it's going to have a massive interest in racing towards a nuclear weapon, because I'm not sure what security guarantees Donald Trump could give the Iranians that they would believe. But the flip side of that is that then it's quite possible that the US sees no choice but to destroy the Iranian regime, even if that means state collapse. And so, I mean, whether or not we see this as sort of Israel tricking the United States to adopt their aim. So if you say that Israel always wanted state collapse, they sort of said to Trump, you know what we could do? We could just drop a few bombs and then get a better deal. Maybe they always knew that a better deal, that was incoherent. But the outcome could be that Israel has tricked the Americans into a war where the only, quote unquote, good outcome for the Americans is the complete destruction of Iran, which is, a worrying conclusion if that does sort of make sense as a description of the balance of incentives at this point in time.
Yeah, Israel would no doubt like that. And, it's kind of, I would argue it's entrapped Trump. The Israeli Netanyahu has had his ear. Many pro-Israel donors and advisors have had Trump's ear. We know he famously doesn't listen to his own military and intelligence briefings. But on this question of, the U.S. then choosing to escalate to go for like Iran's destruction or implosion, it's really a question mark how far the U.S. can go, and if it's and the biggest deterrent to that is just the continued regional costs. So right now we're already saying again that the Strait of Hormuz is closed. A lot of the Gulf, some energy facilities have been targeted. They are actually shutting down. The cost for the global economy, stock markets in the U.S. and elsewhere, the price of gasoline in Europe and America, these are all going up. This is going to create a political cost for Trump. And so if they want to go, towards regime collapse, first of all, like right now, we're not seeing regime cohesion being affected. By all accounts, Iran had this strategy that, again, was telegraphed and was, more or less public, of dispersing the military and political leadership and infrastructure in preparation for this war. And for every leader having multiple successors, and again, just spread out across the country. And for now, all the key structures, all the key institutions are there. Like right now, there's this leadership committee, the interim leadership committee. They're in the process of selecting the next supreme leader. There's an intense competition going on in that regard within the system. And the Islamic Republic has mobilized its base, and even beyond its base, many Iranians, despite the deep-seated grievances and opposition that does exist amongst, millions of Iranians, many do not obviously want their country to come under war. And the more it hits, it goes towards total collapse and fragmentation and, invasions from kind of separatist groups and these things that have been reported, that's only going to, I would argue, further unify Iranians. So the point is that this option of going for the total destruction of Iran, the U.S. really has no good options. If they want to go and hit all of Iran's critical oil and energy infrastructure, Iran still has the capability, and most likely will continue for a long time to have the capability with these drones and these other things to really go and destroy a lot of this. Because right now they've hit like one-off strikes, and it's more kind of the market itself adjusting to the realities of, it's too risky for the tankers to go across the straits. The Qataris and Kuwaitis are themselves shutting down their energy stuff. But if they, we can be in a scenario where there is a kind of mutually assured destruction vis-a-vis the energy infrastructure in the Persian Gulf. And then, short of ground troops in this scenario where this is not Iraq 2003, where that regime had no base, arguably. The Islamic Republic, for all its faults and all the shrinking legitimacy that it has had in Iran over the years and decades, it still has a base. And again, there's this broader Iranian nationalism that comes into play in this scenario. And these are all just obstacles to the U.S. being able to escalate further. So I think, Trump really walked into a quagmire, and he has no good options, I would argue.
Something I'm finding very difficult as a non-expert, someone sort of reading the coverage of this war, is trying to ascertain who is closer to the truth when they talk about the strength or the brittleness of the Iranian regime. Because there's lots of, experts on Iran, many of them Iranian, who are giving very different accounts. So there's a guy, Ali Ansari, who's sort of one of the leading Iran experts in Britain, who keeps going out on the media. He's sort of a historian, sort of saying how brittle this regime is. People keep acting as if this is a really sort of strong, competent regime. Actually, it was a personalist dictatorship, and the whole thing could easily collapse, and everyone will get egg on their face who said this war was a bad idea. And then there's lots of people on the other side saying, actually, this is a really sort of, not necessarily competent, obviously unpopular in many quarters, but let's say a regime with deep roots in the country. What would your advice be to me as sort of how should I try and ascertain which of those is more true? Because obviously there isn't that much access to Iran at the moment. What do you think of that?
Well, we just have to look at the reality of the situation, just the facts on the ground. So this narrative of Iran being a paper tiger, a weak, regime on the brink of collapse, it's been challenged not just by the proven resiliency of the government, the state, but also the population by and large for weathering this unprecedented economic warfare that's been waged against them for decades, but especially since 2018. They've withstood that. A lot of covert action, a lot of that we know about publicly now through reporting. And then we also, the June war that they withstood, 12-day war that was launched with the intention, again, of spurring an uprising, spurring regime change, and that failed. This war, again, in the midst of these narratives that are widespread, that really I don't think they come as much from, let's say, the US intelligence agencies, which probably, arguably have a more accurate assessment of the situation in Iran, but you see in the public sphere, amongst many pro-Israel lobbying groups and analysts and the Israeli government, which Trump, again, those people have had his ear more. And, he's been riding high on the Venezuela operation, on the one-off strikes against Iran last summer. And he was led to believe that he could, with taking out Khamenei and with this kind of operation, the regime was brittle and it would collapse. So we're almost a week into this now. Again, the facts are that it hasn't collapsed. There's no sign of collapse. There's no sign of an uprising, which again, this doesn't mean that the regime is popular, but for a variety of factors, including that it has a base, including Iranian nationalism, including all the missteps in US policy that has, even the very disaffected Iranians more worried than anything. And it's hitting back, and it has leverage in the Persian Gulf. It has leverage with, these attacks it's doing in the region. So I think, a lot of Iran policy, and I'm involved in the Iran policy debate in Washington, D.C., and, I've seen, and I think in the UK, it's similar. There's a lot of the typical factors that are associated with bad policy making. It's very prevalent, groupthink, confirmation bias, wish casting, people kind of projecting what they want to be the reality, when in reality, the evidence has always been there in front of us. And many people have been saying it very, as loudly as possible. So I think, much like the Iraq war that was led, we entered the Iraq war also based off a lot of bad analysis. The Iraqis were going to greet us as liberators, that this is going to transform the region, et cetera, all the media complicity in that at the time, but it seems like we haven't learned a lot of the lessons because, a couple decades later, similar thing is happening. But I think, as the evidence reality is just hitting us all in the face, I think it's also a wake-up call for, we need a better foreign policy establishment, whole pipeline that is more reflective of reality to prevent our countries, the UK and America, from getting in these quagmires that are ultimately not in the strategic and any kind of rational definition of American strategic interests, and certainly not good for the American people, taxpayers, all the blood and treasure that's going to be wasted.
I'm still trying to work out so the question I'm going to ask about the reporting from earlier in the week about the CIA arming the Kurds. And obviously, my initial reaction is that's a terrible idea which is trying to bring about civil war and state collapse in Iran. So sort of as a plan, I don't find it so shocking, especially for the Israelis. They want state collapse in Iran. Why the hell anyone would brief that to the media, to me seems completely bizarre, because the only people I can imagine benefiting from that are the Iranian government, right? Because if you're trying to create some unity among supporters of the regime and, Pahlavists or opponents of the regime, if there's a big story that the Israelis and the Americans are actively trying to foment a civil war, sort of led by an ethnic minority, is that not exactly the kind of story that is going to shore up support for the Iranian government?
Yeah, this is why I'm saying, these leaks in and of themselves, both from the Pentagon last week, right in the days leading up to this war, we had reports in all the major U.S. publications that the Pentagon, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, were concerned, were actually the voices against this war, were warning about munition shortages, interceptor shortages. And then we had, now days into this war, there's leaks of the New York Times intelligence officials saying, the prospects of an uprising in Iran was always remote. Or now, we're seeing all these leaks talking about the US CIA is trying to arm the Kurds. So I think, leaks generally serve a strategic purpose in the US kind of establishment media. And in this case, to me, it suggests that a lot of these military and intelligence institutions in America, they've thought this was a bad idea. And by leaking it, they're not making it easier for Trump. They're making it, as you said, harder. Because yes, when the reality of the situation is that most Iranians, the vast majority of Iranians are not going to like this idea of, these groups in Iraq being armed to come in from Western Iran. And if there's one thing that, for better or for worse, that unites a lot of Iranians, it's kind of ethnic minorities that are kind of militarized, and they worry about, separatism and all this stuff. That's been a big constant threat in Iran's modern history. Going from the monarchists, Reza Pahlavi supporters. Reza Pahlavi actually last week warned separatists that then, when this Kurdish coalition got formed before the war, he warned them. He said the territorial integrity is a red line, and he explicitly called them separatists. And these are the same groups that now are potentially going to be involved in this operation, which I'm hearing from sources both in Iraq, amongst Iranian Kurdish organizations, and in the KRG, Kurdistan Regional Government in northern Iraq, that they're all against this, actually. Trump has been trying to force the Kurds to do this. It's a doomed thing. And the Kurds have obviously been used and abused many, many times by the US government over the decades, from the 70s, when they were basically used by, Henry Kissinger and the Shah and Saddam Hussein, through the 80s, and then in the early 90s in Iraq, where the Kurds were abandoned, and, many, many of them were slaughtered after the Gulf War, to most recently in Syria, where they were used. And now al-Shara and these people have taken over that Rojava, and there's been so many massacres just in the past couple months. So it's just very cynical, the U.S. policy vis-a-vis, this minority group in the Middle East, the Kurds.
I'm not sure if you saw the reporting from CNN. So they've got a man now inside Iran, and he gave a report at a petrol station on the way to Tehran, so not quite in Tehran by that point. And he was sort of saying, everything seems to be functioning quite well. The shops are open. I just got a coffee. Everyone's out. It doesn't seem like the state's about to collapse. I don't know what you're hearing, from across the country, from your sources, about sort of how life is in Iran.
I'm Iranian American. I was born there. I grew up in the US. I still have a lot of family there. We've managed to get in touch a few times with this past couple of days. Seems like a lot of my family is just still in Tehran. But, people are terrified. They're seeing these bombs fall. They're worried. But I've heard something similar, that, life is remarkably, and a lot of Iranians who are intermittently getting access to the internet, it seems like today the internet was on somewhat, a lot of people were online, that life, despite all these things, goes on. And people, I've been reading reports of people at coffee shops, people at, restaurants, and it's a very interesting situation. But so, yeah, I think there's always been a big disparity between how the situation inside Iran is portrayed by the dominant kind of Western mainstream media and the reality of the situation on the ground. And now it seems like that disparity is as big as ever. But it's interesting that, the CNN reporter is in there and he's giving these on the ground reports.
Let's end on, a joke really, which is Donald Trump saying he wants to say in who becomes the next supreme leader of Iran. I just wanted to get you to sort of comment on that. Is this the sign of a man who understands how Iran works?
Not at all. And it's just striking to me. It's like, I don't know who has his ear, because this is something that's pissing off Iranians from, again, the opposition, the monarchists, who are very upset nowadays, because he's basically humiliated Reza Pahlavi, and he's talking about working, with the government to secure another supreme leader. And then, you have this ethnic minority separatist kind of movements, and then it's just total mess. And it's not obviously he's not gonna have any say in this process. Iranians, the Islamic Republic, as this unpopular regime, I would argue, what it is ultimately beholden to, and kind of similar to Trump, it's always just doubled down on its base, throughout the decades. And so it's lost, all these other Iranians, but it's always doubled down on its base. So now it's more than ever needs to double down on its base, which is in the streets right now, which is at, these big Friday prayers across the country today. And so, obviously any kind of leader that comes out of this that has the slightest association with Trump or America, I think it will be political suicide for them, like that system. And again, he can't do regime change. Unless he sends hundreds of thousands of troops into Iran. So yeah, to me, just, I don't know who's advising him. It's just, he's been all over the place.
I said we'd end on that question. Just one last one briefly, which is, there is commentary about who the next supreme leader will be. Should we be paying close attention to this, or do you see this as a bit of a is this consequential?
No, yeah, it'll be very consequential just for the future direction of Iran and the country and the Islamic Republic. So there's many contenders, and there's been many contenders. This secession has loomed large over Iranian domestic politics for many years now, given Khamenei's advanced age. He was almost 90 years old. And, there's hardline candidates, there's more moderate, pragmatic people. There are people who kind of have a certain reformist pedigree, who can arguably be appealing to a broader segment of Iranian society than just the kind of hardline conservative base. But it seems to me this war has kind of empowered, those hardline candidates more. So it's always been rumored that, for example, Khamenei's son, Mujtaba Khamenei, would be a potential successor and candidate. I've always kind of thought that was not really possible. I mean, he's never had a public profile. It was always more in the realm of conspiracy theory. But I mean, he was always a powerful person in his father's office. But now there are these reports. I mean, we can't say for sure at this juncture that, he is on the short list or he's one of the main contenders. Again, there's also, I'm sure, a lot of disinformation just to influence this process, to destabilize this process, because, someone like him is very polarizing in Iran. But I think, whoever the next supreme leader is, it's going to tell us a lot. We could learn a lot about from the get-go, depending on who it is. If it's one of these more moderate people, what direction Iran is going to go. Is it going to be like a hardline IRGC-backed person who's going to immediately go for the bomb, if not already they're going for the bomb? Or is it going to be someone who's going to try to open up things in various ways? So it will be quite significant.
Before we go on to our next story, we've got an event coming up. It's no secret the world's billionaires are using London as an investment account. There are over 11,000 empty homes in Westminster, and it can be very hard to find out who owns them. So who are the mystery billionaires behind Britain's decline, and should they be made to pay up? Dalia Gebrial Kojo Karam will be discussing that question and more. That's live at the Earth Theatre on the 19th of March. They'll be joined by the brilliant Faiza Shaheen, investigative journalist Peter Gagan, who's had a lot of impact at the moment on his Democracy for Sale Substack. He's one of the people who really uncovered the Labour Together scandal. And also Stephanie Brobby, a recovering private wealth lawyer turned activist. Tickets available from Dice and via the link below. The global cost of the US and Israel's war of choice against Iran is already being felt in the oil and gas markets, and it could be about to get much worse. The energy minister of Qatar has told the FT this today. So he said, "This will bring down the economies of the world. If this war continues for a few weeks, GDP growth around the world will be impacted. Everybody's energy price is going to go higher. There will be shortages of some products, and there will be a chain reaction of factories that cannot supply." Qatar is the world's second largest producer of liquid natural gas. It paused exports earlier this week after an Iranian strike against one of its plants. For the global oil market, it's what happens at the Strait of Hormuz that is proving most impactful. So the Strait of Hormuz is a sea passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the open sea. So it connects the oil fields of all the Gulf states, especially oil from Saudi Arabia and then gas from Qatar. 20% of the world's oil supply passes through it. This graphic from the Telegraph shows traffic in the strait on the 27th of February on the left there. And then on the right, you can see traffic from on March the 3rd. Sorry, so you can see it's pretty much completely come to a standstill. Oil tankers, which have attempted to cross the strait, have been targeted by Iran. You can see one there. And now, unsurprisingly, the insurance for any tanker who wants to make the crossing has become prohibitively expensive. Following comments from the Qatari energy minister, oil prices today hit almost $90 a barrel, up from $65 at the end of February. I'm now joined by David Waring, Assistant Professor in International Relations at the University of Sussex and an expert in the relations between Britain and the Gulf states. Welcome to the show, David. Great to have you back. Talk to me about the Strait of Hormuz. Lots of people over the last week will have been sort of reading about it, finding out about it. As someone, who's written a book about the relationship of Britain to those Gulf states, and, oil plays a big part in those stories. What should we know about the Strait of Hormuz?
I mean, it's the jugular vein of global capitalism. Think about it that way. As your graphics showed, 20% of, I think it's 20% of oil that's shipped by sea goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And I think it's a similar percentage of liquefied natural gas. But it's not just those things. I mean, that's enough, right? I mean, that's a significant proportion of global energy supply. And that's energy not just for transport, but for industrial production. But it's not just those things. It's also all the derivatives that come from oil, synthetics, petrochemicals, plastics, fertilizers. Oil is really the lifeblood of the world economy still, unfortunately. And gas is a significant energy source as well. So, I mean, global capitalism doesn't function without this stuff for long. And if you have a big sort of disruption to this, a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz, in terms of oil, for example, that affects the global price of oil, which in turn, sooner or later, will affect the global price of everything. It will take a little while for it to work through the system, but sooner or later, it's going to affect everyone. Hence the comment from the Qatari energy minister, which I thought was really interesting, because that's the Qataris trying to raise the alarm. Basically, that's them saying this is a major emergency, and trying to put pressure on the Americans ultimately, but also trying to put pressure on other actors in the global system, including the Europeans, for example, trying to galvanise alarm so that pressure can then come on the Americans to stop this. And it's not alarmist, it's really serious. The global price of oil just before the war started, I think, was $72. And it has actually gone over $90 at the end of today. So that's just in a week. It's gone up by a significant percentage. If it gets to 150 and stays there, which it probably will, if this war continues, then we're talking a major global economic crisis, a really serious one, when we're only just recovering from the 2022 effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what that did to global inflation.
And I mean, this in a way is the Iranian strategy working, right? This is what they've decided to do. They've said, Israel and America, if they're going to sort of go to war with us, we are going to raise the cost for the whole world, especially American allies in the region, but also everyone, with the hope that will put pressure on the United States and Israel to hold off. Now, I don't think Israel are going to be particularly, amenable to arguments such as that. But Donald Trump, of course, he does care about inflation or the price of gas, as they call it, petrol going up, because that would affect his voter base for the midterm. So this is sort of, I suppose, Iran using a choke point effectively.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's you can see the logic, you can see the strategic logic of the whole response, right? The attacks on Gulf states, the attacks on shipping. I don't want to say it's legitimate. Attacks on civilian targets are always wrong in my view, but it's perfectly predictable. You can see why they would do it. And listen, I mean, I've been following this stuff 20, 25 years now, and I mean, in the mid-2000s. People were saying, if you waged a war of aggression against Iran, if you tried to topple the regime, as the neoconservatives of the time wanted to do, it was widely sort of understood that this would be the sort of Iranian response. So when we heard Donald Trump say a day or two ago that one of the big surprises for him in the war was that the Iranians had carried out these attacks and tried to disrupt the Gulf economically, you have to wonder who's advising him, and you have to wonder why people like Keir Starmer and Merz and Macron weren't trying to raise the alarm with him as well. You could see this war coming from space, and you could see it was widely understood what the response from the Iranians would be. So this whole global economic crisis that's now barreling towards us at a rate of knots has been perfectly predictable, easy to predict, and you have to wonder why more people weren't saying to Donald Trump before it happened, not least Keir Starmer, you can't do this, and this is why it would be so disastrous. But apparently no one wants to stand up to this guy, or very few people do.
Because it will impact Europe and Asia more than the Americans because they are now they're an oil exporter. So because oil is a global market, it will make oil more expensive for consumers, but some of their big companies will profit from this because the oil price has gone up and they're an exporter. I think with gas, the Europeans will be much more affected than the Americans because we're more reliant on liquid natural gas than America is because, again, they produce so much of this stuff.
This is all true, but remember that these effects work through in stages. So it depends how long this war goes on. If it goes on for several weeks into a couple of months, like you'd have already felt the direct effects, and then the second order and third order effects will come. Look, global capitalism is interconnected. So people like the Americans who might think they're insulated will find soon enough that the ripple effects will hit them. So, yeah, maybe they're overconfident now, but they shouldn't be.
And how pissed off are the Gulf states going to be with this? Because, I mean, there's kind of a deal, isn't there, with the Gulf states and especially the Americans, which is the Americans get to keep, their military bases on their territory. I suppose until America became the net exporter of oil, America would buy their oil. And in return, America was supposed to guarantee their security. But now the Americans have started a war which they're bearing the brunt of. There aren't bombs falling in the United States of America. The bombs are falling in Qatar or Bahrain. So for them, is this a betrayal?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, I've been reading some of the reporting over the last few days. You're not going to get, I suppose, sort of outright forcible statements against Trump and against Netanyahu in the same way as you've had from, say, Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister. But from what I'm reading in the reporting, you're getting lots of a sense that Gulf officials are briefing aggressively to journalists that they don't like this. And you can well understand why. I mean, the way you put it, the deal was that the Americans, provide a security umbrella to these Gulf states. The security umbrella is external and internal. And one of the reasons the Gulf states have been doing all this quote-unquote modernisation, which is a problematic term, but we'll leave that to one side. The reason they've been trying to change their economies, diversify their economies, is to help the regime stay in power, keep the public happy, diversify the economy, liberalise socially, if not politically, to keep the people happy and help the regime stay in power. Now, this is doing enormous damage to the Gulf's viability in terms of the economic model they've been trying to develop over the last 10, 15 years, becoming global hubs, becoming more interconnected, attracting tourism, stuff like that. The Americans have undermined that. The Americans have undermined the Gulf monarchs' economic survival strategy just as much as they've undermined their external security by starting this war. You could argue pretty convincingly that, yeah, of course, it's the Iranians who are attacking the Gulf states, but the Iranians are attacking them as a predictable consequence of this American and Israeli act of aggression. So it doesn't... the Gulf states would be quite justified in thinking this is our protector, the Americans, is potentially our biggest security threat at the moment. And yeah, you can sense the frustration. The quote you put up there from the Qatari energy minister is a sign of that. But there's a lot more of that sort of thing in the reporting from anonymous officials saying how concerned they are.
And your book from 2018, Anglo-Arabia and Why Gulf Wealth Matters to Britain, I mean, it was specifically on the relationship between Britain and the Gulf states. So I want to discuss that and bring up a map as well, actually, because I keep hearing from sort of UK government officials, sort of the reason that this, that we're now involved in this war, even though we didn't start it, is because we've got all of these interests in the region. You can see we've got a base in Cyprus with 4,000 personnel, and then much smaller bases, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, and then Bahrain, 300 personnel in Bahrain. Now, from my understanding, sort of a UK base in these regions is a bit like a little area cordoned off on an American base, because it's the American that's a real military power, and we just sort of have a little zone for ourselves. Why do we have these military bases in the Middle East? Why do we need all of these?
Yeah, it's not a sense of we needing the bases. I mean, David and Michael and everyone watching at home don't need military bases in the Gulf. this is a hangover from the British sort of imperial period in the Gulf, going up to the 70s when the Gulf states got their independence. The British have been trying to cling on to that imperial role, just as the British state has been trying to cling on to its power and influence in the world system. And when we talk about defence, in quotes, it's difficult sometimes to disaggregate what is legitimate defence. Like defending British citizens in the Gulf, that's legitimate. Defending the British homeland, defending British legitimate interests, that's all fine. And what's actually just about the British state wanting to project and maintain power in the world system for its own interests, and in terms of like the interests of the concentrations of capital and class interests that align with the British state. And for me, having like major military bases in the Gulf is more about the latter than the former. Yeah.
And I mean, does having those bases mean that we do inevitably get brought into a war when this kind of thing happens? I mean, if there is there has been some kind of drone attack on Cyprus, hasn't there been? If Britain has personnel there and they get killed, are we suddenly at war with Iran?
I mean, this is the danger when you're there and you can potentially be treated as a target. And then kind of credibility almost demands that you have a response, and political credibility at home, because obviously Starmer has been getting a lot of stick from the right over this attack on Cyprus and the British supposedly not being ready to repel that or to respond to it. So the more you're present in a region like that, in a volatile region like that, and your quote unquote interests are attacked, then the more exposed you are to being dragged into a conflict, whether or not that's what you wanted. It's one of many reasons why we need to really rethink British foreign relations, rethink British. What do we mean by defence? Are we trying to defend Britain as a country? Are we trying to defend our allies in Europe? Or are we trying to project power on an intercontinental basis, which is a hangover of empire and a function of our kind of collaboration with American imperialism?
David Waring, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Always great to get you on the show.
Thank you.
We've been reporting for a while on the simmering row between the AI company Anthropic and the US government over the use of Claude. Now, as we discussed before, they're at loggerheads because the Pentagon wanted unrestricted access to Claude, so to use it for whatever they wanted. However, Anthropic wanted to limit the use of Claude for fully autonomous weaponry, so they didn't want it used in weaponry with no human involvement, and they didn't want Claude used for spying on American citizens. Now, the Pentagon, we already knew, had already cut ties with Anthropic over the row, but on Thursday they went further. So it was officially announced that Anthropic would be deemed a supply chain risk. And what that means is it blacklists the company. So anyone that wants to work with the Pentagon has to show that they're not using Claude, that they're not working with Anthropic. So Sam Altman and OpenAI have taken advantage of the situation, not very honourable people, swooping in to sign their own deal with the Pentagon, saying, oh, we don't really mind, use OpenAI, use ChatGPT for whatever you want, you can have it, we'll take the income that Anthropic have foregone. And in an internal memo to Anthropic staff, Dario Amodei, so the CEO of Anthropic, seemed furious at both the American government and Sam Altman. So he said this to all staff members. The real reason the Department of War and the Trump administration do not like us is that we haven't donated to Trump while OpenAI and Greg Brockman, who's one of the founders of OpenAI, have donated a lot. We haven't given dictator-style praise to Trump while Sam Altman has. We have supported AI regulation, which is against their agenda. We've told the truth about a number of AI policy issues like job displacement, and we've actually held our red lines with integrity rather than colluding with them to produce safety theatre for the benefit of employees. And that's a reference to OpenAI, who have tried to say, oh, we've also signed up to some safety commitments, even though they're not worth the paper they're written on. That memo was leaked on Thursday. It was written a week before, but after it was leaked, Amodei apologized for the tone, but he is still taking legal action against the Pentagon because he's saying they've broken these contracts without good reason. So should we praise Amodei for taking a stand for his beliefs and for AI safety? Is he one of the tech CEO good guys? Well, the historian Rutger Bregman is among those who thinks he does deserve credit. So Rutger Bregman says, my God, finally, after all the cowardly law firms, universities, media networks, tech oligarchs bending the knee, after all their disgusting sucking up to Daddy Trump, finally a CEO with a real backbone. Finally a CEO who shows real moral leadership. Dario Amodei, thank you. So that's one position. It's been widely reflected on social media, actually, because, I mean, this does seem like someone who is taking a risk, putting some principle before profit, which is only too rare. Not everyone is convinced, though. I spoke to an expert earlier today who doesn't think that Amodei deserves too much praise at all. Nate Soares is co-author of the book, If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies, Why Superhuman AI Would Kill Us All. He and Eliezer Yudkowsky, so the co-author of the book, are two of the most prominent thinkers arguing that super intelligent AI could escape our control and then cause a truly apocalyptic outcome. So as the book says, kill us all. Really, really fascinating book, and we'll be putting out a longer interview with Nate in the coming days. For now, though, I asked him about this particular story, and this was his verdict on Anthropic and Dario Amodei.
I think it's great that he is standing up for his principles there, and I think that takes a certain type of spine, and it's good to see some people having it. You know, you also got to see this in the context where, Anthropic also has or used to have what they called responsible scaling policies, where they made commitments to, not release AIs that might be horribly dangerous in certain ways. And in the same week that this was happening, we can talk about, like, who knows whether it was coincidence or who knows whether it was quietly released during a week where they were showing their principles in other ways. They sort of announced that they were reneging a lot of those commitments. And they're like, and props to them for saying out loud, we're reneging on our commitments. We are decommitting. We no longer are committing to not releasing models we think are horribly dangerous. But if you sort of look at the reasoning about, like, hey, why are you backing off from those commitments? The reasoning is sort of like, well, no one else was doing these commitments, and we were finding it really hard to figure out whether our models were horribly dangerous, and we were finding that we had, like, a lot of internal pressure to tell ourselves our models weren't dangerous when they might be. And our answer to this is to remove the commitment that we're not going to release a horribly dangerous thing.
The responsible scaling commitment was to say, the moment we think we have a model which we cannot sort of certify as safe, we'll shut it down or not release it. And they've said, oh, actually, that threshold was a bit
Turns out that's too hard. Yeah. And it's...
The DoD stuff, though, I mean, because your argument is, if we make super intelligence, we can't guess how it will kill us, but it will find a way. And does that mean that you're relatively unmoved about whether or not the Department of Defense has unrestricted access to advanced AI? Because ultimately, if the advanced AI can't kill us with fully autonomous drones, which it's been provided access to by the Pentagon, it will find a different way. Is this sort of arranging deck chairs on the Titanic?
It feels pretty deck chairs on the Titanic-ish to me. Even if it is given access to Pentagon autonomous drones, it might find another way to kill us because, the autonomous drones just probably aren't actually the most effective way to do so if you can invent your own technology, right? Like, again, we're sort of talking about automating the thing that lets humans start with their bare hands and wind up with nukes. From an AI's perspective, a very, very smart AI that can make lots of copies of itself, that can run very quickly, that can run its own technology, that's in charge of a lot of robots, building its own supply chain out. Probably it's just easier and faster if, so it might not even worry about killing the humans if it doesn't worry about us too much. Maybe it just keeps on building automated factories that produce more robots, that produce more factories, that produce more robots, and those just spread through the continents, and humans just die underfoot. And it just defends itself if we sort of send in humans with guns. Maybe it doesn't try to actively kill us, or maybe if it worries about the nukes, it tries to actively kill us, but it's probably faster to do that with a virus. Once it's at the point where it doesn't need us than it is to do it with guns that the Pentagon happened to hand it. So, whether or not it really gets access to Pentagon weaponry, I think that has very little to do with whether the AI is dangerous on a civilizational scale. That's more about, is it really smart yet? Can it escape the lab? Can it autonomously reproduce? Can it make smarter AIs? those are where the sort of civilization-threatening lines are. What we can see with the DoD stuff is who has what kinds of principles. And, unfortunately, I think this is just a situation where having principles, having good intent, being willing to stand up for what you think is right, those aren't enough to make the AI happen to really care about what you wished it cared about.
Because obviously, I mean, I suppose you can say Dario Amodei looks a lot better than Sam Altman at this moment, because Dario Amodei sort of said, I've got these red lines, I'm not moving them. And Sam Altman comes in and says, oh, okay, we'll provide you a model with no limits. So, I mean, it's all relative, isn't it? And he looks braver or less sort of purely cynical.
Sure, but this is all monkey politics around like who gets to stand closest to the suicide bomb when they press the suicide bomb button, right? So like, sure, one person's a more moral person who, or maybe one person is sort of like has more principles, and the more principled person presses the kill everybody button. It's like, okay, can we not press the kill everybody button?
And I suppose, I think what Dario Amodei should, I suppose actually, so a question I have, do you think Dario Amodei has and I'm focusing on him because he seems like the one who most plausibly does have some principles, right? Sam Altman, I think, does seem like potentially just a cynical sociopath. I don't know the guy, but that's sort of an impression I have formed. Dario Amodei seems like a more reasonable person. Do you think he has an intellectual disagreement with you?
I think the people who start these companies are selected for thinking they're going to be able to keep control of very, very powerful AIs. I've had a number of debates on this issue with Dario over the years. I'm not entirely sure whether, like, how you classify the disagreement. Dario these days is less skilled than his company's chatbot at summarizing the arguments for why alignment is difficult. Sometimes he'll write things where he's like, we'll have it under control because of this, that, or the other. And you don't need to listen to these concerns because of this or that reason. And you can just go ask Claude, his company's chatbot, like, what might somebody worried about AI alignment say to this? And it'll have, quite a bit better understanding of the difficulties than Dario writes. Is this because, Dario has a cleanly staked out academic position where he's got strong counterarguments to the arguments? I don't really think so. I think it's more like he doesn't really want to think about it. He's the sort of person who doesn't feel like you need to think about it. You're looking at a selection effect of the sort of person who thinks it's okay, the sort of person who by their own admonition says, I think there's 25% chance this goes horribly wrong, and thinks it's okay for themselves personally to roll those dice. A lot of people don't start a company like that. You're looking at the sort of person who does.
And I mean, I think Dario Amodei, if we take your argument sort of seriously, which I do, I mean, we're going to get onto this at the moment. I think a political problem here is that, someone like myself, I don't feel like I have the expertise or understanding to say, I agree or disagree with you. All I feel confident saying is, I take your argument seriously. But we'll park that for one moment. If your argument is true, I actually think that Dario Amodei, probably of anyone, I mean, Sam Altman as well, but he's not going to do it, has a chance to save the world. Because I think if he said, look, I've got hundreds of billions of dollars invested in this company which I own, I am worth billions. But I think the danger is so great that I am willing to shut my company down. I know that my shareholders are going to take me to court because this is against my fiduciary duty. I will presumably be breaking some contracts because they've signed all of these deals with NVIDIA or various companies to buy their GPUs, and now they're not going to do that anymore. He would be making a huge sacrifice by just saying, I'm shutting down my company tomorrow. But it would be really difficult to dismiss him. No one would be able to say, oh, it's just because, he's just jealous of Sam Altman. Because he is running what many people now think to be the leading AI company. He's got billions invested. If he were to say, I'm throwing it all away, I really think that would change the political dial. I don't think people
Absolutely.
would say, oh, okay, well, Anthropic's out. Now let's let Demis Hassabis and Sam Altman, battle it out. I think people would stand up and say, oh, my God, we need to do something. So I think, if we're to believe your argument, he is potentially the most powerful person who has ever lived.
I think, so I think he has that power. And this is the sort of thing that I recommend people do when some of these lab leaders still ask questions of me, which happens sometimes, although more rarely than you might hope. And often I even say, without throwing away those billions, you can and I think should be begging the world to shut everybody down, including you. That's sort of like an obvious consequence of saying you think there's this huge chance of catastrophe. And the fact that they're not doing that, I think puts a limit on like even the thing that wouldn't cause this huge splash, even the thing that wouldn't cause them to give up their $1 billion. They're not even doing what I consider the basics. I think this puts a bound on how deep those principles actually run. And then, in terms of, does that mean, that these people are the most powerful people because they could shut their labs down and cause the political conversation? The way that this would wind up saving us is the rest of the world seeing that as an alarm and putting in place a treaty of we're just not rushing towards super intelligent AI. Nobody understands this. We're nowhere near ready. You would still need the world to react properly. You would still need world leaders around the world to say, we are stopping the suicide race out of fear for our lives. In some sense, that is the power that saves the world. And the power that I think these company executives have is the power to alert the world, which I absolutely think they should be using more.
That was Nate Soares speaking to me earlier today. Do look out for a much longer version of that interview. We go through all the arguments in his book. I have to say, I think it is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, issues facing the world right now. Is there a technology that's going to kill us all? It doesn't get bigger than that. For now, though, for tonight's show, my thank yous to Sina, Toossi, to David Waring, and to you guys for watching. We'll keep covering the story of the war on Iran next week. Do come back on Monday at 6 p.m. For now, have a good weekend. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.